Okay, so when we say the medieval period, we're essentially covering over 1,000 years, arguably. And the names and the area categorizations, what else on the target sheet? Were given by later historians or later art historians, so just be aware. But we're going to start with early Christian art, aka AD, is when Christianity, well, is when Jesus Christ lived and died, when he was crucified and came back 3 days later. And so we're looking at late imperial, about 200 years later. Originally, Christianity, again, it's in Judea, so you're up in more like the Middle East. And he was Jewish, so it was seen as just a sect of Judaism. Like they were looking for the Messiah, and so some believed that he was the Messiah. And so they continued on with these Jewish practices. It doesn't become, it's not called Christianity until hundreds of years later, where it's considered separate from Judaism, a branch from it. But let's talk about the late imperial period. Caracalla, how does his portrait define this era? Yeah, that mistrust. Tell me about the political turmoil of this time period. Right. Right. Yeah, everybody gets assassinated over this period of time, correct? So it's very bloody. Also, geographically, Rome is much too big to be controlled, essentially. So you've got chaos across the empire, you've got chaos for rulership. So the late imperial period, pretty much after Marcus Aurelius, the plague helped push everything further off the cliff, is we start to see the downfall of Rome, as demonstrated by this turmoil. Okay. We split up the empire. First, it split up into our two main Caesars, and then kind of two emperors, and you've got your Caesars who are supposed to follow. Found by this little statue. Really, tell me about how this artwork reflects the political circumstances of the time. Right. So the message originally was to do what? That they were what? Working together, leaning upon one another. All these four areas were united, that the emperors would help the Caesars. But what is it really reflecting? Right. Did this work? This four-ruler divided empire? And so then what we have is Constantine. So he was a co-ruler, but of course they're battling. Just like any conflict, be it even you with your own parents or siblings, it's always about power. And so, of course, you can't have four rulers. And in 312, this final battle occurs. Now, remember, before this battle, he has this vision of a cross the night before. He has this dream of a cross over the battlefield. So he interprets that as if he converts to this outlier religion of Christianity, or this new sect of Judaism as seen at the time, then he would be victorious in his battle. And so he believes that, and he converts on the low key, but he wins this battle in 312. He becomes the official sole ruler of the empire, and so he embraces Christianity. The following year, he has the Edict of Milan, which is the agreement to treat Christians benevolently. Okay, so they are to be left alone, basically, because he himself has turned Christian. Now, all religions are still, there's so many, and so they're all able to practice what they wish. We don't have like Christianity is the dominant religion by any means. It's still an outlier. But we have this embracement of it. Then in 330, he moves the capital from Rome to Byzantium, which he renames Constantinople, so city of Constantine. This is now known as Istanbul in Turkey. Tell me how moving the capital of an empire reflects the downfall. Right. I mean, Rome has fallen so far. It's pretty much this crime-ridden, dirty city. Things are falling apart. He moves it to Byzantium, which becomes Constantinople. Now, in a moment, we're going to look at the geography, and this is actually a great political move. Rome is too far on the edge of the empire, so you can't control. He tries to put it in the center as like this, the capital in the center of the empire is this last-ditch effort to gain control. but it essentially doesn't work out. He dies in 337, and then by 476, the Roman Empire is overtaken by a German chieftain. So some historians label 476 as the fall, but some others label it as the move to Byzantium. But really the late empire, the different empire than our peak Rome. So it's all the fall. Okay, so here we are from Rome to Constantinople. This had been the capital, and here we are with lose control of this area. We've got your Germans taking over, move the capital. But also politically, this makes way more sense because the economic activity of like our Silk Road, well, I guess that kind of comes later, but we've already got those ideas, etc. We already have the precursors as well established. And so Istanbul, even today, is one of the most important ports in the entire globe because it connects the East to the Middle East, to Africa, to Europe. So it's one of our main connecting points. And in this time period, it's just as important and similar. So it makes sense politically. Again, it's this last-ditch effort to bring the empire back to its prime. Doesn't work out. We'll start with early Christian art, but just of where we're going. Our Byzantine Empire is named after what was Byzantium, been called Constantinople, because here's the center of this new empire, which lasts almost 1,000 years. However, unlike other empires that we've studied, where it's like this establishment of a civilization that leads to this grand empire, the Byzantine Empire is different, and it almost starts at its peak, okay? And then it just goes downhill from there. Peak of Justinian. So we're only about 100 years after the fall of Rome officially. Here we are. So some ideas for the whole medieval period is learning was centered on specific fields. They were transmitted through Europe, trade, pilgrimage, military activity. There's so much communication across different cultures and regions of these three continents at this point: Asia, Europe, and Africa. Medieval architecture is mostly religious. During the Byzantine era, Christianity is the only allowed religion in that whole region. So you're building huge churches. It's also a new power move. So of course you're going to move or create new structures to demonstrate that power. For much of the medieval period, they avoid figural depictions, but there's other times when they allow it. So we'll study some of both. At times, medieval religions will reject images. We have two periods of iconoclasm where they purposefully destroy any type of figural images associated with Christianity. We also have explicitly, at least known, records of donors and those who patroned buildings and art, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this rise in status of patrons and donors. We hit on this with Islamic art, but we also have a ton of spoiler going on where they're using previous structures, architectural elements, and these new ones. So, I mean, here's our Arch of Constantine, and he actually chips off some of the lunettes here, circle little motifs, as well as the paneling, are actually chipped off of the other arches that had already been made that were dedicated to other emperors. So think of how that reflects the almost economic turmoil of this time period as well. The other arches are in a state of a poor state. Also, you're not able to necessarily afford new marble reliefs. So it's indicative of how Rome has started to fall already. Okay, so let's start with early Christian art. So we're going to dive into the catacombs. Now there's this like fun little myth that, early Christians had to worship in the catacombs because they were so persecuted, or that they were brought to the Colosseum en masse to be killed. And that's not accurate at all. There were many, many religions during this time period. Christianity was like the new one on the outlier. It was an outlier. So they were like the underdog who, think of any type of social setting as someone who's not adhering to the social setting norms they're picked on. So Christianity was similar to that, where it was like the new one. It was weird. It was different. So they were picked on a bit, but they weren't persecuted to the extent of those myths. These catacombs weren't used as churches. They were burial grounds. The Romans had primarily cremated their dead. Some had, or a few had buried, but for the most part, they were cremated. Christianity, though, they believe in, or at least early Christianity, believed in the burial of the dead. And so these catacombs, I mean, you have decaying bodies. It's not a pleasant environment. It is a foul odor. So these weren't places for worship, in other words. And also the Romans, they had respect for the dead. They aren't, whatever your funerary rites are, they're not going to mess with the dead. So again, it's not like they were being pillaged or persecuted for the catacombs. They were okay if it was underground, it was out of the way. There's no room in Rome to bury above ground, so underground it makes sense. And you also have catacombs in Paris, but the Roman ones, they extend, 7 to 9 miles. Some historians think even more. We just haven't uncovered it. Certain areas go like 5 stories down below ground. So these are extensive, were used over a few hundred years, etc. Not just like any other burial grounds that we've studied, is you've got your more lower class area. And then we're going to look at some of the higher class, wealthier burial catacombs where we see the art produced. Okay, so this religion is brand new. You're establishing the symbols, how to communicate this message. Now, just like any new ideas that are coming through, think back to like the spread of the spread of Buddhism, etc. What do you do to help communicate a new message and to not freak people out of this new message? Right, you're going to use familiar symbols to communicate the message of this new power, okay, of this new religion. So what we have, we'll talk about Christ the Good Shepherd. But first is they're figuring out symbols for Christianity. They're using the symbol of the fish. Also, Jesus Christ is the founder of it. So before the cross becomes established, which we're now associated with Christianity, we have what's the Chi-Rho symbol. And all that it is it's the first letter of the Greek 2 words, Chi-Rho, for Jesus Christ. Okay, so the early symbols of Christianity, you have a fish, and you have this Chi-Rho symbol, which is just the C and the Chi-Rho, the 2 first letters of the words in Greek for Jesus Christ. Okay. Now I want to talk about this transition of using a familiar motif to communicate this message for a new religion. So does anyone recognize the image on the far right? I have shown it before. Based on the formal elements, I'll give you a hint, it's Greek. What time period is it from? Archaic. Okay, so we have our almond-shaped eyes. This was, if you guys remember, I showed it during when we talked about the Credos boy, is that transition from archaic to classical. He was buried right near him at the Acropolis near the Parthenon. So this shepherd is actually a very common motif. You're probably familiar with the concept of a shepherd, but I bet you've never seen one, right? Because it was it's a popular symbol. So what is the role of a shepherd? To watch the sheep, and what else? Do sheep always stay in one place? Right, to lead the sheep, and if they wander off, think of like a shepherd's hook, a popular symbol, is they pull that sheep back. They forgive them for stepping out away from the group, for doing something wrong, and they're lovingly embraced back into this whole flock. Think of how that idea of forgiveness, which is emphasized by Christianity, can be communicated through this already familiar concept and role and idea. So initially, Jesus Christ is seen as the Good Shepherd, okay? Now that figure on the right is a shepherd. He is carrying his lamb, but however, in this case, for most religions across the globe, there's an important element of sacrifice. And so with the Roman pagan religions, they would sacrifice an animal, oftentimes a lamb, for part of this religious devotion, etc. And so in that element, next to the Parthenon, it was part of sacrifice. And the belief with Christianity is that Jesus sacrificed himself. So these familiar concepts are being pulled into Christianity to communicate this new religion. Now, also the idea of like Jesus with a beard that we're more familiar with seeing today doesn't come around until a few hundred years later. Initially, he was clean shaven and he was modeled after the god Apollo. Images of Apollo were used to create the earliest images of Jesus. So it's important to note that. And so what we see within the roofs of many of these catacombs is this design that's then going to be pulled within domes that we'll see, dome structures. But you have this rounded area, painted circle. And in the center is the main figure, oftentimes Jesus Christ. It's the most important. Your eyes are drawn to it because it's centrally placed. That round circle is called a roundel. The central circle is the roundel. These other half circles that most of the time depict scenes from the Old Testament, actually, are called lunettes, these half circles. And here we have one of many images of Christ the Good Shepherd to communicate this message of forgiveness and his sacrifice. Mostly forgiveness. So new terms, roundel, lunette. A lot of the early images also reflect what's prefiguration. So they are figures from the Old Testament, also found in the Torah, also found in the early part of the Quran that comes a few hundred years later. And these are figures that precursor the ideas of the New Testament. So actually, many early depictions of Christianity focus on the story of Jonah and the whale. So Jonah is an Old Testament figure. He preached of the coming of the Messiah, which then that sect of Judaism believed Christ was the Messiah, the Savior. But anyway, so Jonah is important, and he gets swallowed up by this whale. And he has faith in God. He's terrified. But 3 days later, this whale spits him out on the shore, and he is safe. So this mimics the story of Christ. It's like a prefiguration, this figure for Christ, the story of Christ, where he is sacrificed, 3 days later reemerges. Okay, so it mimics it. That story of Jonah, which they would have been familiar with under the Jewish faith, communicates this new message. It's familiar. Now look at the depictions of the whale. Do you think any of these people had ever seen a whale before? Okay. All right, so now we're going to go into the Catacomb of Priscilla. As you can see, just entering into this burial ground for her and her family, she's of a wealthier status. I mean, they have their own little hallway called the Greek chapel. So they would come down. I mean, just as today, many people will go visit the burial grounds of a deceased loved one. Oftentimes, even in ancient times, they would do the same thing. They've converted to Christianity. They go down there, they would pray. So it's almost like a little chapel, and respect and their deceased loved one. And here we are within the main area. Well, actually, this isn't the same one, but just giving you an idea. These little niches is where the dead would be buried. Many of them have this circular structure. In the lunettes were images from the Old Testament. Don't you guys remember? Let's look at these figures here. What did I say before the influence of Buddhism? What was the symbol for prayer in Christianity for the first few hundred years? Yeah, the raised hand. So all these family members have their arms raised in a symbol of devotion and prayer. So that symbol of prayer with your arms lifted is in that state. They're called an arant. So artistically, when we're looking at that, it's an example of a arant, where they're in that symbolic act of prayer with the arms lifted. The loculi is the name for the niches where the deceased bodies would be placed. We can see even like the skulls in that one. Whereas a lower class, less wealthy individuals were placed along these mass numbers of loculi. So just like most or all the burial sites we've studied of the wealthy, where they brought these goods, or in this case where they showed these. Many of these deceased people likely had goods with them, but they, had been well looted before our history came about, really. Okay, so here's our Catacomb of Priscilla. We had our chapel that led into it, which was much more decorative than actually the walls around here. But we're going to focus on the ceiling, partly because of how clear it is compared to others. The fact that it's lasted over 1,000 years is really cool. So tell me, what is she doing? Right, she's praying. So she's showing her devout piousness to God. Of our lunette, with Christ the Good Shepherd in the center, that common symbol representing him in the beginning. Later on, the dove from the Old Testament also becomes an important symbol in Christianity, it begins there. But what's neat about this one is that this was likely, perhaps she was like the first to be deceased. Now think of with funerals even today that you may attend of a loved one, how the photo that they use is likely when they were young, let me back up. Let's say you're attending the funeral of a loved one who died of old age. The photo that they're likely going to display is of them younger, right? So we have a similar argument for our catacomba Priscilla, that this is her, likely died of old age, but she's being depicted as younger. And I say old age because what's going on over here? Who's over here on the right? Yeah, so it's actually likely her husband, her kids, and her grandkids. Because here we have an older individual who's seated. There's a kid in his lap. But then right here, we've got a younger couple with a child in front of them. So it's likely like her husband emulating their children, or another grandkid, one of her kids who got married and had a grandkid. And so there's Priscilla with her family. She's showing herself as devoted to Christ in this act of prayer. She's wearing typical dress of practice in Judaism. Again, it originated as a sect of Judaism. Christianity doesn't come about till later. Now, on the right side, here's what's really interesting that a lot of art historians argue, is she's seen over here, her family's seen over here. So some say that, oh, this is a depiction of her when she was younger and after she'd given birth to her firstborn. And that may be entirely accurate, but others argue that this is an early depiction of Mother Mary, so the mother of Jesus Christ, and that she's associating herself with that had already been in play within the philosophy and discussion of Christianity. Either way, it helps to precursor later images of Mary. Okay, so she's seated, holding the baby. Yanarant. So these areas where the doves are called pendentive. Here, I mean, it's a carved out dome, but later on, like tonight, I'm pointing this out now because when you're supposed to watch that video of Hagia Sophia, the pendentives are actually structurally supportive of the dome. And so we see that carved out here. It's this carved triangular, a vaulting supports the dome. So that's what you'll see with the Hagia Sophia. Okay, but also what's neat is one of the reasons why we're focusing on this one, even though the condition isn't superb, but we still see this impressive artistic depiction of three-dimensionality on a flat space. So think of, most likely, if you've never taken art class, or think of elementary, if you were to draw a figure, you draw a circle for the face, nose, mouth, and shade or color the face one single color, right? It was flat. This concept of modeling, that's the statement, that we're using light and dark. We're using shadow and highlighting. So you need to know those terms: modeling, light, dark, shadow, and highlighting, to create this idea of three-dimensionality of volume. So here's like another example of a Roman portrait. But where we see how like the left side of her face and chin is in shadow, the left side of her nose and her eyes, then look at what's highlighted. It's part of her forehead, her nose, and this right portion of her face. So tell me, where is our imaginary light source coming from? Right, we can see it, we can imagine it, it's accurate. So these artists are talented artists. What we'll see with medieval art, though, is we draw, this is classical in that regard, where there's this attempt at depicting a naturalistic looking figure. The rest of the medieval ages, there's less of this emphasis on depicting the natural figure, and it's more just the concept. But this modeling is pretty neat. Okay, comments, questions, concerns? Okay, so you read about Roman basilica, civic buildings, the church. Let's talk about Santa Sabine. This is like antique Europe, aka early Christian. It is our explicit basilica, church plan turned church. Or basilica civic building turned church. And so with that document, you need to know the definition of the nave, of the apse, of the aisle. Tell me, with the religious structures that we've studied thus far, think of our Lakshmana here, Hindu temple, our great Stupa Sanchi, can't talk, Buddhism, as well as the Kaaba and Islam, Dome of the Rock as well. What is an important action that pilgrims do when they arrive at all of those they have in common? Walking around, circumambulation. So Christianity is going to do the same. It's going to do in human nature. And the aisle on the outside of these columns is you would circumambulate around it. Now, it wasn't as established as like seventh time, well, some sects of Christianity, but later these, and we see it here, is these carved out niches are established as we go through the Middle Ages, and altars would be decorating this area. So as you're walking around, you're contemplating each of these altars, often depicting saints, etc., or stories from the Bible, and so it's meditative in that same way. Just as when you think of like the Bora Bora Buddhist temple in Indonesia, and how it was really long, and all these images of Buddha's life and depictions of him as you were walking around. So similar concept. Okay, and then what we also need to recognize is this gold in, it draws your attention to heavens. So we talked about that with Islam. Remember, Islam comes about 300 or about 200 years later. It's not established till 600 AD. And so it's a Byzantine element. It comes from the Byzantine popularity. But we see that everywhere. I mean, it's beautiful, it works, people are familiar with the idea behind it, so it uses that. But up here, I want to draw your attention. What is this called that we saw with the Temple of Ra? You guys remember with the lights at the top? The clearest story, C-L-E-R-E. Story. And that A functions to let light in. We don't have electricity, it's a bunch of lamps, etc. So it allows light to come in this high roofed building, but it also has this really ethereal, like, halo effect. And you're going to see where Hagia Sophia tonight takes that element of a halo and just further develops it. So that clear story. And think of how, I mean, almost every belief system, there's this idea associated with enlightenment or conversion of seeing the light. I've seen the light, so light is an important message and essence as well. Light streaming down from the heavens. Now, if we look at all the beautiful details of the materials within here, all this marble and granite, etc., we're an era of spoil. Christianity is the only religion allowed to be practiced under this empire. Those Roman temples you're not allowed to worship there, so what do? Pull elements from them. So most of the interior of the structure consists of spoila. All these little neat elements at the top were pulled from a Roman temple. You can see these columns were, and look how interestingly they did it. You could tell that this was one column, but they needed it to be higher to support this structure, so they added another one, and they attempted to carve the same fluting to make it the same width and circumference. You can tell they're separate. They're from two different temples put together. So all these little elements give us a good idea of what these Roman temples used to look like, because they were pulled from there. Okay, comments, questions, concerns? Okay. So Byzantium, the Byzantine period, is extremely long. It's 1,200 years. So even the name was given by later historians. Oftentimes it's divided into early, middle, late. You don't really need to know that, but just know that we're very much generalizing 1,200 years right now. Now, the Byzantine Empire, here we are close to the beginning. At its peak with Justinian I, 527 to 65. The red outline shows the empire. We're in Constantinople, Byzantium. And here it is. Like I said, it almost begins at its peak. And here's Emperor Justinian. Now, is Rome or the country of Italy relevant anymore? Not really. The church that we're about to study is in Ravenna, Italy. However, Justinian had never even made it to Italy. It had become so gross at this point, essentially. However, there were two periods during the Byzantium era where iconoclasm was practiced, where they intentionally destroyed images of figures in any regard to Christianity. Like, they were destroyed. And so we're looking at this place because it's one of the very few churches with images that lasted. Most of the other ones were destroyed. Think back to that video with the Dome of the Rock, how they said that the Dome of the Rock was centrally planned based on the many other Christian churches that were around it that no longer exist. So Emperor Justinian ruled 527 to 65. There he is. And here is San Vitale in Ravenna, centrally planned church, moving away from the basilica. And this centrally planned church, it's actually one of the few ones that we find in Italy. Most of them were basilicas based off the Roman Empire. They would have been all around the eastern part of the empire, but like I said, they've now been destroyed. And what's the Ottomans took over in 1453, but a lot of them were destroyed or converted to mosques. Okay, so this is just like a tourist video, but it's so hard to get photos of the interior of this. I want to give you an idea. And look how incredibly ornate this is. All these different materials, indicating the wealth of Justinian. Or spoila. So here we are looking at the apse. We're going to start with this picture of Jesus and some angels. Dome. You're breathing. Oops. What did I do? So you've entered in, we're looking at the apse. Of course, this is where your focal point is, where your eyes are drawn. So who else would you have other than Jesus depicted there? Okay. Here's where like the rites would be practiced and the priest would be preaching there. Here we are close up. Does this look familiar? Right. This is extremely familiar. It looks just like all the paradise depictions that we saw with many of the paradise depictions we saw in Islam, right? This is a couple hundred years before it's established. Islam came about during the Byzantine era. So they're going to use these beautiful images, this gold, these floral elements. It's beautiful. Why would you not use it? And it helps to communicate this message, right? And it demonstrates the wealth and the power. So all these cool depictions, these colorful ones, are all made out of mosaics. Small little cut circular tessellae put together to create these mosaic images. These green domes and ceilings are really like symbolic of Byzantine art, by the way. Okay, so here we are looking at Jesus Christ. Now, if you'll think back to our Pantheon, and I talked about those periphery columns, those purple columns in the front that were transported from Egypt, really expensive. Then think back to the tetrarchs with the periphery purple image. Purple is associated with wealth. Even the ink used to create the garments, etc. The dye used to create purple garments is extremely, extremely expensive. So, hence why Jesus Christ is depicted in purple out of respect. There's this concept or idea of like Christ the King. So, shown in this purple robe versus the other ones who are not. This is a little brownish purple. So we know this dude's important, which we'll get to. He's holding, and also his outfit is very elaborate. You've got this gold representing his power, his hierarchy. He's centrally placed. Our eyes are drawn toward him. He has a halo around his head, and other individuals do, even though the angels are obviously holy. Well, they have darkened halos, I should say. But he has this like really explicit white one with a cross behind it. So it's almost like bedazzled, jeweled. He's got this circular space around him. And think of how that like represents he's in like a different space, that he is divine. Okay, that he's outside of our realm. He's other. Now I'm starting, tell me about the figure on the right. We have these two angels. We have a person from the church or something, or his apostle, one of his apostles. Tell me about the right. What's he holding? Yeah, he's holding the church. So he was one of the bishops who was associated with bringing about the idea and funding for creating this church. So think of how highly he thinks of himself. He's got like a similar darker robe like Christ, holding the church. He's hanging out with Jesus. So he's showing his own power. Now, what we're looking at is over here is Justinian. Tomorrow we'll get to his wife. But you've ever heard like the phrase, my right-hand man? Okay. This idea of like being to the right of someone is a position of power. So during this era, the emperors were associated with, or were seen as being the rulers on behalf of Christ. They were not the head of the church, but they were representatives of like Christ's rulership on earth. So he is purposefully placed to the right of Christ to show how he's acting on Jesus's behalf. Okay, so here we are. We're looking to the left, and we're zooming in. Tell me what is similar between these two. How does Justinian communicate his power? Which one's Justinian? He's centrally placed. He's the only one in this scene with a halo. He's wearing the full purple robe. Right, here's this one white. Yeah, he's got this beautifully decorative brooches and garments. He's got the halo, he's got his crown. I mean, he's emperor, he's king. But think of that imagery that we just saw with Christ. He's using for himself to communicate his power, his hierarchy. This new message of where he's acting on behalf of Christ. What do you notice about his feet? So they're really decorative, yeah. But what else? Tell me about all their feet. So this is intentional. These artists during the medieval era were out of our like depicting naturalistic, realistic images necessarily, and it's more about the message. Tell me about the placement of his feet and why that's specific and what message it communicates. Right, look how he's standing on top of this other guy's foot, and he's in front of his two attendants, high up there in the political scheme, and his soldiers behind him, right? So he's in charge. But look at this guy's feet. He's definitely even ahead of Justinian. And we look, he's in front of these other church members. But as our eyes draw upward, who's in front of him according to their bodies? Justinian's in front. So this really reflects this power play that's occurring between the emperor and the head of the church this time period. Okay, and how they're both vying for power. It acknowledges the power of him, but our eyes are first drawn to where Justinian is in front. Then you see there's like some credit given. Oh yeah, but he's still head of the church. So there's this huge power play going on. If you are familiar at all with Christianity, does anyone know how many apostles stayed with Christ for the most part? 12. How many people are surrounding Justinian? Okay, there's a little guy's head seen over here. 12. So he's showing himself subtly as having 12 followers as well. His little entourage has 12. So he's directly associated himself with this Christ-like manner. Okay. and his robes are more purple than the others. So let's briefly talk real quick some of the objects that they're holding. We have one who's holding the Bible in this beautifully decorative cover. Has this gold, it's got gold, it's got jewels. We'll study a couple manuscripts that were really ornate during this time period. Not many people could read, very few could write. Your handwriting the Bible was extremely precious, or I mean, these monks are handwriting. He's holding a cross that's now an established symbol of Christianity. However, over here, what's found on their shield? Yeah, the Cairo symbol. So the Cairo symbol is still the symbol of Christianity, but the cross has taken precedent. Okay, so we still have our Cairo symbol. Now Justinian is holding this gold bowl, and it reflects the rite of the Eucharist or communion. So with one of the stories of Christianity is before Jesus was sacrificed, before he died on the cross, he had dinner, he had supper with his 12 apostles. And the Last Supper, and he drank wine and he broke bread, and he said the wine represents his body, the wine represents his blood, which he was going to spill, and the bread represents his body, and it's broken. Okay, he's making the sacrifice for them, they're partaking in it. It's not cannibalistic, it's more like reflective of this idea of committing to Christ, of acknowledging his sacrifice, and that's practiced in the church, differently by whatever sect you go to. But he's holding, you need to know this, because he's holding the bowl that holds the bread for the Eucharist. So he, even though he's the leader of the empire, he is taking a leadership role with this important Eucharist rite. Have a great day.